Hear me, Bree?
Hi, Representative Each. Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, hi, how are you? Thank you. Yeah, I can hear you now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll call the informational hearing to order.
Good afternoon.
And I will turn the mic over to my co-chair, Representative Horn, for remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to note that our ranking member, Representative Cheeseman, has had a death in the family and is unable to be with us today. She will certainly read the materials available, but we extend her our care and love. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And we wish her and her family the best at this difficult time. I see the commissioner has arrived. Thank you very much, Commissioner, and congratulations on your nomination and confirmation in the last 48 hours or so. Look forward to working with you, and we're excited that you are in this job and all the experience and knowledge that you are bringing. I have no doubt will help us grow our economy in the state of Connecticut. So this is the informational hearing forum regarding Brainard Airport and the study that we voted $1.5 million for last session. And just for the public's edification, informational forums are by invitation only, and we have the Commissioner O'Keefe here as well as folks from VFJ Planning Consultants. They will be presenting the findings of the study that was undertaken since we passed the bill last session. So, Commissioner, you have the floor, sir.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator Fonfara, and thank you for the congratulations. I was actually just sworn in 15 minutes ago, so I have been commissioner for all of 15 minutes, but appreciate your kind words. So this study was completed last year, as I think you all know. So while I've had the chance to read it, I was not myself involved. It really is the extent of my involvement to date. But DECD did facilitate the consultant's report, and we do have its principal authors here today with us to present an overview of the report and to answer any questions the committee might have. As I've said previously before publicly, my only focus is economic. My lens is an economic lens, which means, in my view, understanding the highest and best use of any asset, any state asset, is really my primary focus and concern. So I look forward to learning more here today, and we'll ask Thomas Madden to take us through their findings, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. With me today, I have Frank Fish. He is one of the founding members of BFJ Planning. As well, we have Ronald Price. He is QED Airports and Aviation. He is on the Zoom call, and he's available for having any questions answered as it relates back to airport operations. What we'd like to do is just go through very quickly the introduction. We want to talk about our development options. We're going to do a very quick overview just on Hartford Brainard Airport, and then going really through the meat of the report itself, which is the development scenarios, conclusion, and then we'll open up the floor to have any questions and answers for this. As we moved, I want to put right up front, we have our preferred development scenarios, which is really scenario one. This is limited aviation development, or that no build option. And this is just keeping the airport as status quo. It remains open. It includes upgraded new air traffic control, runway extensions, about 94,000 square feet of aviation related facilities, but the existing airport continues to operate. We have scenario two, which is an industrial redevelopment, which is a partial closure of the airport, which is the closure of runway 1129 and approximately about 18 acres of industrial uses that we'd look between about 200,000 square foot buildings and then about 20,000 square feet of retail. Our third scenario that we looked at was industrial focus, was again a complete closure of the airport for redevelopment. This is the development of over 2.6 million square feet of industrial space, another 140,000 square feet of office space, another 100,000 accessory retail, there would be no aviation operations on that scenario. And again, for number 4, same thing, complete closure, no aviation operations. But we looked at 2,700 rental units, approximately 260,000 flex space of industrial space, another 105,000 square feet of retail, and about 255,000 of indoor-outdoor recreation, as per what the legislation had asked us to look at. So I wanted to give just a quick bit of history on the airport property itself. In 1951, you had a 4-runway configuration. This is when it was owned by the city of Hartford. By 1971, when you look at the historical era, they started to realign everything, and you can sort of see the old runway underneath. And this is where runway 220, the long runway, was on there, and the crosswind runway. But City of Hartford started to redevelop parts of this into an industrial, really an industrial area, and then our area of 2020, where it sort of got the build out of where it is today. Just to put it in context of what the actual site, it's a 200-acre site that we looked at. You have a water treatment plant, MDC, to the south. You have a decommissioned waste to energy facility up to the north, and then industrial park uses all around it. One of the things we wanted to point out that on the Environmental Justice Index that the CT Deep just put up online, this site ranks a 10 out of a 10. What does that mean? This, in terms of environmental justice, ranks the highest for pollution burden and sensitivity of population on any type of developments. And so we used that, a little bit of that, to factor into the overall look of what we did. So assessment of airport operations, because that was one of the things we were asked to look at. If the airport were to close, we looked at development costs of receiving airports. It would be roughly about 7.3 million. This is to build out tie downs, hangars. It would require the repayment of unauthorized grant of the unmarketized grant to FAA of nearly $2 million. And then as well, we would have to go through subjects of findings to the FAA to find closure results that is really a net benefit to civil aviation. So the closure is really what the FAA is looking for, is higher and better uses, is really not considered by the FAA. So if we were to redevelop this, it's not considered higher and better. It's really what is the net benefit to civil aviation. The only other way to really close it down is to go around FAA, and that is really may be directed by US congressional legislation. I did want to point out that the development cost is only 7.3 million. This is not including the rebuilding of the CT Aerotech School or the Civil Air Patrol building, which is by our estimates anywhere from about 45 to 60 million on top of that, because you would have to replace those facilities if the airport was closed down. One of the things we did look at was the current fiscal impacts of the airport itself. It was important because this is the questions that came up during our public sessions with a lot of the different people surrounding the airport and the municipalities, and especially with the city of Hartford, was the pilot payments. And so we need to point out that the state makes the pilot payments for all state-owned property. This property is under state. So basically the pilot attributes to state-owned, it's equal to about 45% of the property tax. Unfortunately, the state has underfunded this pilot within the area for the last couple decades. So they did do in fiscal year 2020, established a new allocation for pilot funding for cities with higher needs, which City of Hartford is. Now Hartford receives 50% of the total pilot formula as a tier 1 city. This results in an effective pilot calculation that is about 22.5% of the property tax in the case of the pilot. To put it better into a chart that everybody can understand, for fiscal year 2023, all state-owned property in the City of Hartford is about 1.1 billion. The real estate property tax rate is 7.43%. The state mandated pilot rate is 53%, and the tier 1 pilot share is 50%. So the value of all property within the City of Hartford is $21 million. If we carve out Hartford Brainard Airport, the assessed value is roughly about $40 million. The 7.4% real estate property tax, again, state mandated pilot at 50%. We calculated roughly about $668,000 of that pilot is what the share would be for the Hartford Brainard Airport that goes to the City of Hartford. Looking at environmental floodplain concerns, because again, this was part of our mandate. We went through an extensive environmental phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. It's all in the reports and the appendices, and that's probably close to about 1,000 pages that we put in there. The areas that you see on your screen right now are high release areas which exceed the remediation standard regulations for deep. And one of the things that we went into really in depth on this was specifically because we heard anecdotally that there was seepage coming from the Mira site and there was coal tar on the property. So we actually expanded the number of soil samples that we did through the drilling, as well as the water samples at the request of DEEP throughout the entire airport. We mainly focused particularly on the northern part of the site itself. You can see in there from R16 up to R30, around a lot of the original buildings within the site itself. What's interesting is we actually found no coal tar, and we did not find any seepage coming from the Mira site to the north. What we did find was some PFAS and some underground storage tanks, as well as the normal stuff that you would find on an airport that's basically been operating for this length of time. From there, we were able to look at an opinion of probable cost for remediation, as well as a remediation plan. The other thing that we took into consideration when we looked at the development was the groundwater conditions, and this is part of the flooding, because again, when we started to look at hard costs, you had to understand the depth of water on this area is anywhere from 6 to about 11 feet below surface. And so on the lower parts behind where the new tow drains will go in, the groundwater, it really does impact that site. You get some seasonal flooding throughout. We also did some testing looking at the metals, the VOCs, and like I said, the PFAS. The other thing that we looked at was floodplain considerations, and this is behind Clark's Dike, mainly because the amount of money that needs to be invested back into this dike. The accreditation basically expired in 2019, and you have roughly about, I think it was $17 million that we looked at worth of improvements that need to happen behind the dike before any type of development or any developer that we did interview would need to have in place, mainly because they need those insurance that the dike would not fail for any type of investment. So going into our development options, what we did is we did a complete market scan of the Metro Hartford area, the South Meadow area. So we looked at demographic trends, economic conditions, and the real estate market. In particular, with the demographic trends, population, household, race, income, education, to really establish a baseline as we started to look at the impact of what the airport was and in each of the different developments that we'd have to put through the in-plan modeling. Economic conditions, employment, growth factor, regional competitiveness, and then again, the real estate market. What is out there? Because we were asked to look at both commercial, retail, recreation, and a mixed use. So again, what is the real estate market in this area, and would it support any type of development that actually would bring about a return for any type of investment on that property? So going through just quickly the demographic economic conditions, we have a declining population in Hartford. It fell 3%, while the capital region did grow by 1%. So there is growth outside of the Hartford market. We found that there's a softening of the job market in Hartford. So again, the metro area grew about 0.4%, which roughly equated to about 2,500 jobs. And then within the city of Hartford, actually lost 2,800. There's a strong regional growth in transportation and warehousing development as seen from the amount of warehouse development. And we can use East Hartford as an example with Rentschler Field. You can look at the development all along I-84 and then around Bradley Airport. One of the things that we did look at as part of when we started to do the actual analysis within each of the different subsets, manufacturing is really a priority for the sector or for the sectors in the state. And the idea was to look at manufacturing employment to try to increase that by 235,000 by 2033 for about roughly a 4% annual growth. So as we started to dive deeper into the information, we did a full market study on office. The tough thing with Hartford is you have a lot of corporate relocations, a loss of office employment, and remote working trends because of COVID. There was a downsizing in the relocation from Hartford, and it pushed the downtown sub-market vacancy above 20%. And I think it's actually, if we going back to it now, it's actually even higher from when we looked at this over a year ago. It's really limited office development in the broader region. And it's really, we're finding these figures may represent the market over the next few years. Again, this is something, as the former economic development director of the city of Stamford, is something I would track continuously when I was with the city of Stamford. So when you do a comparison of market indicators, vacancy is roughly 24%, but compared to the COG, 11%. Average rent is a little bit higher because you do have those type A or class A office buildings and class B office buildings. But in the really the capital regional district area, it's a little bit lower because, again, the classification of the building. You had no new space that was constructed and no new space that is under construction within the city of Hartford. Retail. So again, looking at both the city of Hartford and the capital regional district, basically the Hartford Brainerd site location makes traditional retail very difficult unless you're looking at select big box retail, which we think may work on that site, but it would require additional improvements for transportation to get into the area to handle that amount of people coming in. Rents have grown modestly in this one, and retail, when we looked at it, would be through transportation modeling would basically, you'd be drawing in from a much larger area. And so now you're competing against what's happening over across the river, East Hartford, Glastonbury area, but also into the West Hartford and what's being developed there. So again, new space constructed in Hartford is roughly almost 400,000 square feet from 2018 to 2023. However, you have only seen about 8,000 new square feet of space under construction compared to the CROG, which has seen over 215,000. Industrial, again, we dove really deep into this one because this seems to be where a lot of the development is now heading towards. So again, the broader market could support industrial on this site, as well as distribution uses within the Hartford Brainerd, but it may have some size limitations due to some of the environmental factors that we had talked about earlier. So the interstate corridor has been very healthy all the way through this area. This is sort of the hub when we talk about the New England region for connections to several different highways. And the rents have actually grown about 5.5%. But there is some competition, and that's that 2.2 million square feet over at Ranchland Field in East Hartford. So when we start to look at the overall space constructed from 2018 to 2023, it's roughly 2.7% and an average rent of 6.6%. Prague region is roughly about the same at 6.7%. And that's what we found throughout the entire region was roughly in those numbers to be able to pay for any type of new construction. Again, I-95 corridor was about 115,000, but the Prague region was almost 1 million square feet due to some of these much larger projects that we started to see. Multifamily. One of the things that we looked at, and this was one of the hardest looks that we've ever had to, that I've looked at, was that really the current multifamily rents would not be able to support an amenitized development on this site. When we looked at the vacancy rates, it is still at 6.3% in Hartford and the Prague at 5%. These are very low vacancy rates, but when it actually came to looking at the rent and the capital stacks that you needed, we did talk to like Mike Freeman as well as from CDRA, as well as numerous developers on this one. The going rent is in Fairfield County is roughly about $3 a square foot. When you come to the Hartford area, you're roughly getting just close to $2 a square foot. The average rent has been dropping down to about 1.5, depending on the project itself. The problem with that is when we started to look at the deep dive, and I'm going to go into this in the next few slides, is when you looked at the different capital stacks. And when we did the initial investigation over a year ago, the capital stacks that were involved would require additional subsidies. So when you look at CDRA, they were putting in over a year ago just about 20% of the project cost to help subsidize that capital stack. I just talked to Mike Freeman about a week ago. They're now up to 30% in terms of subsidies that the Capital Regional District has to give to make a project feasible within this area. The other thing that we wanted to talk just a little about is the challenge of the residential development that we heard from a lot of the different developers who could possibly be interested in trying to develop on the site. You have that large sewage plant to the south of it, and then you have the decommissioned power plant to the north of it. Around it, as I showed in that one of the previous slides, was you have all the industrial land around it. So again, we have run into environmental justice issues. The other thing that the developers pointed out to us that it's really isolated with no real retail to try to get into it. So it's a cutoff by the Connecticut River, the railroad, and I-91. Lastly, we looked at recreation. So again, looking at the environmental conditions and locations, there is constraint to this. When we started to look at just within the area itself. So there is modern environmental constraints putting a park use there to be able to fund it and then remediate all the property that we would have to go into. There is demand for indoor facilities such as field houses, and we did put that into consideration as part of the overall development options. As well, we looked at how Riverfront Recapture Trail could be rerouted from the dike to Connecticut Avenue. I will point out, BFJ Planning, we did the original Riverfront Recapture Plan that you see is sort of really helped out the downtown within Hartford itself, and we're very proud of that one. The other thing that we looked at was just the actual park, and this map that you see up there is location of all of the parks within the city of Hartford. So the South End area is really currently served by the Cole Park and Goodwin Park. None of the parks really, there's no real parks on the site. So we put that into our first overall matrix that we presented, which is really opportunities and strengths. So residential, yes, there's an opportunity to increase the tax base, but the constraints is the development cost is really at a premium. There's a lack of proximity of amenities within that area, and there's environmental issues because of MIRA and the NBC plan. There's also a need to evaluate the capacity of sanitary sewer to accept the increased net flow from any potential new development. Office, yes, you're going to get an increase in employment, increase in tax base, but there's a weak market for that. And being competitive with vacant office space downtown, you'll just end up trying to cannibalize that existing market. Industrial, yes, you'll get an increase in employment, increase in tax base, and compatible with nearby uses, and there's a relatively strong market. However, competition with other regional development within the area and the absorption rate, as we found, would take a payback period much longer. And then lastly, we did opportunities for recreation, which increased recreational opportunities, really limited the opportunities to drive visitations because of where it's located and the entrance into this area. But the constraints we found were really the open space and compatibility with nearby uses. And then Hartford's already currently well-served with parks and additional open space. However, there is a limited market for that higher end indoor facilities. And there's been several facilities that have been proposed recently that are sort of moving through the approval process in municipalities nearby. Excuse me. So study options for redevelopment. So one of the things the Commissioner Dom had us really look at was the financial feasibility of each of the different development options. So basically translate the market potential development value and compare against associated development costs. So what you see before you is just our standard graphic, market potential, location potential, and demand. That goes into what overall is the project value. We must then balance that with the financial costs, soft costs, and hard costs, as well as the land costs. And so that is where we start to look at our capital stacks within that financial feasibility. So some of our challenges that I've identified already was the environmental remediation, added costs of piles, water, and sewer because of the depth to the bedrock, which ranged anywhere from 60 to 100 feet on the site. And because you're basically building on alluvial till, because that is where the river deposited for years all of the sediment, there's an additional construction cost that we'd have to go into, as well as what size of buildings and height of the buildings to be able to build on them. We looked at and talked with Mike Freeman about the development of the current stadium just to the north of it, and all of that bleachers had to be put on piles. And that was running anywhere from $150 to $200 a linear foot per each pile going down roughly 80 feet. So you need multiple piles just to even hold the stadium bleachers. Also the added construction costs. So because of the supply chain constraints that we've had over the last few years, any type of mid-rise topology, so looking instead of that traditional 5/1, which is that concrete and metal with 5 wood, as soon as you go up to be able to get the views of the Connecticut River, which is what we were asked to evaluate, the cost starts to become prohibitive in terms of what the rents will be able to hold, as well as construction costs for any type of structured parking. Typically, structured parking runs anywhere from $35,000 to $55,000 per parking space. So as you start to build up, you're going to have additional parking, not just the parking that we would be able to put on the flat areas within the development site itself, and that would be adding into additional costs. So our decision pathway really came down to 3 different options and several different options within them. So option 1 was the airport remains open and continues to look at redevelopment within that. Option 2, airport remains open but closes runway 1129, which is the crosswind runway. It's approximately about 18 acres. And then option 3 was to close down the entire airport looking at redevelopment through what two options from the market study really made sense. So first, our no action. Scenario one, it remains open. Under the CAA plan, we'd look at redevelopment to the north, as well as new buildings, reserved an area along the crosswind runway, which is 1129 for light aircraft. There is a proposal for an MDC land swap of approximately 4.2 acres. And then the MDC property in green there would be allow for a runway expansion and then potential for that future acquisition of an additional 583 taxi runway expansion. So if the airport remains open, each of those stars there represent areas of concern that were brought to us by both the public as well as the market itself. So remediation development plans for any type of improvement in orange would lead to our next evaluation of improvement costs. So you would have to continue discussions with NBC to extend the runway 2-20. There is a need to actually reconstruct the runway 2-20 at some point because of the use and the age of it. You still need to do a crack seal of runway 1129, but again, that is only used roughly 2 to 5% of the time, depending on the type of year. And it's going to be needing a rebuild fairly soon. There's also construction of airfield electrical vaults. Because of that high water table, you do have a lot of moisture in there. And there's a need to rehabilitate the taxiway south and as well maintain the terminal paving areas. Part of what we looked at as well was construction of a new hangar storage area. So overall, the total cost would be roughly about $11 million for those improvement costs, with FAA putting in additional grant money of approximately 90%. CAA would put in 10%, and you'd get an additional $2 million from private funding. We put that through economic impacts in our planning actions. So again, the in-plan modeling for impacts on the region, it proved out to be positive on that. But now you needed the permit actions that would have to run through everything, environmental remediation actions for any type of new development to the north or the new hangars that would go in. You'd have to take into account any of the capital plans for the dike, and that is the new tow drains, as what the Greater Hartford Flight Commission is putting forward, as well as any type of stormwater permits that would need to be applied to them. The also thing that we pointed out as part of the planning actions is, how do you tie this to the future operations in the state for regional aerospace industries? So again, with CT Aerotech School in there, you did invest, I believe it was $10 million on that building back in 2009. If you look at inflation, it would be approximately, to reconstruct that building elsewhere, it's about 16 to 18 million. So airport remains open, but closed. We looked at closing runway 1129, which is really our preferred scenario. So again, to bring in some additional money for CAA on this site itself, and in order to make up for the $400,000 that they are missing because of the funding side of everything. We looked at bringing in a mixed warehouse, which had light manufacturing space for some office, as well as 20,000 square feet of retail building along Brainard. This would require moving to FAA to see if you can actually close that runway down and then be able to build that building for future tenants, which there would be interest in from the development market that we did speak to. So again, in terms of environmental issues and economic assessment, it would require FAA actions. And again, to close it down, we'd have to prove out that there would be a net civil benefit for aviation by closing that crosswind runway down, as well as meeting local zoning. You'd have to have local boards for permitting approval. You would need Army Corps of engineering approval, deep remediation plans for the site itself. If there was a sale of the airport, it would have of that property, and that buildings were no longer owned by or that property is no longer by CAA. The sale of the airport would have to be at market value, and as well as we'd include the remediation costs. This would also require potential relocation of assets. So whether it be the planes, the businesses, state police wouldn't be able to use the cross one way, and then CT Aerotech School near there, if we would start closing things down and just go into straight industrial use. Ideally, you would like to try to keep the CT Aerotech School in place for this option, because it is off to the side. Again, we assess the economic impacts. So again, in-plan modeling, we found that this to be the best and best use. This actually had potential tax impact because of additional tax coming from the development on the site. Development costs alternative, again, pretty positive, as well as we think the permitting actions to do something like this would be worked through both the state and the city and the feds a little bit easier. Lastly, we looked at environmental remediation actions. This had the least amount, and then stormwater permits. Going into a full closure, and this was a little bit more difficult as we started to look at this. So coming from our market use study, the industrial alternative use was probably our highest and best use if we were to go to a full closure. Development program was roughly about 2.6 million square feet. This was 2.3 of industrial buildings, about 140,000 square feet of office, and another 100,000 of retail. Assumptions we did on parking, as you can see on there, we did not put any parking garages in this design. It was really all on-ground parking. And so office was 3 parking spaces per 100,000 and 3.5 parking spaces. We did put the recreational use on this one here. And so we put in what would be considered a driving range to top golf, again, to bring in some additional money. As we started to look at the next one was the residential, which is our scenario 4. The residential use was development of the entire site. We did put indoor recreation on there, and we did put a school and retail, because as you start to do this, and we're putting our city planning hats on, you can't just isolate all of this residential without having amenitized services to help support that population. So again, we put 4 buildings that would actually be above the height of the dike itself. But again, when we started to develop the costs on that and the lower rise buildings and the townhouses, we had to take into account all of the environmental and what was underneath the ground in terms of the groundwater to be able to hold these buildings in place. So total development was roughly 4.2 million gross floor area. Dwelling units was total was roughly about 3,200 with about 16 units per acre. So again, we had to put, because of the impervious surface and similar with the industrial section, you'll see on this one, we put a pump station in there because as soon as you have that increase in the amount of impervious surface, you have to put stormwater somewhere. It's not like I can just sort of run a hose over top of the Clark Dike and put it back into the river again. We have to channel it out and store it somewhere, or to get it back into a system that we can retain it. So with that increase in impervious surface from what we currently had, you'd have to have a pump station that would be able to pump it out to somewhere else as part of the overall development. So again, when we looked at option 3, again, it would require FAA actions. Again, to close the airport, you would need some net civil benefit. You would have to change local zoning with the city of Hartford. You'd have to go through local boards for permitting approval after you've got the airport closed down. Again, Army Corps of Engineer requirement, deep remediation plans. The other thing is, if you close it down, you do have to now sell the airport for market value. That market value would then get put back in as if we close this down. It would go into remediation at other airports to transfer the airplanes and hangars to other airports to meet that. Lastly is the remediation cost of the property itself and relocation of all the assets, including both the state police facilities and the aerotech school. So again, we put it all through impact modeling for the planning actions on this. So what I'd like to go into is how we actually approached the math on this. So again, I wanted to go through a few definitions. One, talking about hard costs and soft costs. I'm not sure how familiar they are with development and when you start to look at performance, but what the hard costs really represent is that tangible expenses. So materials, labor, equipment, construction costs, land acquisition. Soft costs refer to the indirect expenses. So that's your architectural design fees, permits, legal fees, marketing. And so really the hard costs and soft costs, when you put those together, ensure really a comprehensive cost estimate and allows us to really have better financial planning and risk management. This is actually one of the first things you do when you actually look at development itself. So, excuse me, crosswind runway and industrial alternative uses and the residential uses. Overall, the soil remediation on the site is roughly about $1.5 million. Now, when we get to a full airport closure, that is another $6.6 million because you have to tear down all the buildings and remediate the underground storage tanks. Additional roadways that would need to be constructed on the crosswind, it's roughly about $750,000. Roadways for the industrial and residential now are into really 13.6 and 21.3. Increase in water and sewer, industrial and residential are the same at about 3.4 million, but there's less for the crosswind. Power is about 2.7 million for both the airport closure, as well as only about roughly 300,000 for power and communications, park, open space. So overall, the total subtotal on the hard costs is roughly about 3.7 million for the crosswind runway closure, and that would be for the 200,000 square foot industrial building. The industrial alternative use of looking at all of that space in there is roughly about $33 million. And for a residential alternative, the complete build out is about $41 million. Again, soft costs and financing costs, we put that in. So now we come up with the overall horizontal infrastructure costs. So to do the crosswind, it's $5.1 million is what we estimate the development costs to be. And that's to just build out the site itself. Industrial alternative is 46 million. And when we go into the residential side, it's 55 million. So one of the things that we started to look at, and Commissioner Dom said, well, what is the residential land value as part of this analysis? So what this is a financial modeling technique. We really determine the maximum price a developer would pay for a piece of land while still achieving a desired rate of return. And this is really important because this determines what you're going to sell the property for, or what the developer would end up paying for that property. One, if you were to close down the crosswind runway, but also two, if you were to close the entire airport down. So again, it makes an informed decision, and it allows the identification of both potential risks and uncertainties throughout everything. So when we looked at the repositioning scenarios for residential land analysis, this is taking that chart that I explained from those previous built out, the nice actual metrics that we did, and now putting it into, okay, what exactly is the overall building and what it's going to cost us. So project value, when we actually look at the development costs, and this includes all the buildings, for the crosswind runway closure and doing that 200,000, the gross project value when we build everything out is about 49 million. The industrial alternative, building on all that industrial site, is about $603 million. And then the residential alternative brings back $1.03 billion. Now, once we get into the cost of the sale for the rental uses, that is your rent that you're getting on top of those buildings, the less the developer profit, and then total development cost for that site itself, we add all of that together, we now have a total residual value of in the negative. So just the residual value for the crosswind closure is 3.2 million. The industrial alternative is 45.8 million. And the residential alternative with all that development is $511 million. So we are in the negative side when we look at any type of development on the site due to the hard cost, soft cost, and the remediation. I just like to put this together. So when we think about the residual, it's the maximum price the developer is going to pay for the piece of land while still achieving that desired rate of return. So then we moved into, well, what is that rate of return? So we brought about net present value. And this is really, it evaluates the profitability of investment by comparing the present value against all expected cash flows from that investment. Really what the significance is, you want a positive net present value because that is going to exceed the returns and actually turn a profit and get a payback on that property. We also, at the request of Commissioner Dom, was the internal rate of return. And so this is the discount rate at which the net present value and all the cash flows associated with the investment equals zero. So the IRR really helps determine the rate of return on investment is expected to generate and is used to really compare the different investment opportunities to the site. Typically, when I do development and I work on behalf of the developer, I look at the NPV and the IRR in the decision making to say, is this really a go or no go situation when it comes to any type of development? So when we started to look at the return metrics on this and the development costs, the crosswind runway through our in-plan modeling said, hey, you're going to get about $92 million in total benefits. The industrial alternative of about $724 million, and residential alternative is $1.1 million. However, when we started to look at the total cost, oh, sorry, $1.1 billion. Sorry. Yes. Thank you, Commissioner. The total cost into that is 7 million, 70 million, and $868 million, which then provided an internal rate of return of 57%, which is great for the cost win. Industrial alternative is really 32%, and the residential alternative was 5%. So at a 4% discount rate, we basically figured out that it would be $43 million for net present value, 287 million on the industrial, and then 27 million just for the residential. What does that mean in the payback period? And every developer likes to ask, well, what's my payback? Is how long will it take me to get my investment back? So when we actually do all the calculations, the crosswind closure, it's a payback period of roughly 5 years. And then the industrial is 7 years, residential is about 24 years. That is looking at if we were able to close right now the airport, okay? Now we said, okay, let's take into account that it may take up to 10 years to actually close that airport because it may require an act of Congress. And we use the 10-year model because that is when the FAA grants expire. So once those grants expire, the CAA could go close down that airport if they wanted to, because they don't have to pay back those grants or anything. So we said, okay, well, let's look at year 10 because it may take up to 10 years potentially to close that airport down due to what FAA typically looks at. So again, crosswind, it looked at roughly still a 5-year payback period because we started right away in year 1, which we'd be able to start working through right now. But the industrial and the residential, when we looked at year 10, now we started to really drop. And so we went, in terms of the net present value at 4%, we went down to 96% or $96 million. And then the residential went into a negative $91 million. So now the payback period went from 7 years to 17. And then actually the payback on the residential was 30 plus years. It was beyond our 30-year analysis. And I think it was almost close to 40, 43 years is when we expected any type of payback on the property itself. So our conclusion when we came to this really was scenario 3, just any type of delay. The airport closure to year 10 decreased the IR negatively, but significantly reduced the net present value. And so going from 287 million to 97 million really affected the long-term financial outlook of that type of development. And then scenario 4, because of the delay, experienced a drastic drop in the IRR to -7% and negative $91 million, which really indicated the financial feasibility of building out all of the residential, the sports, the office, schools, and everything else really is not feasible at this point. So the payback period for scenario 3 really extended out to 17 years, and scenario 4, as I mentioned, exceeds the 30 years, really making it unsustainable. So after we looked at everything, we said the optimal choice really at this current juncture, if you're going to redevelop the airport, was scenario 2. And the reason why we selected this is because it has an acceptable IRR at 57%. It has a lower initial investment, and it's consistently would increase the tax revenue within the area. So the high IR and reasonable NPV confirm it's really the most prudent and sustainable investment if you're to look at any type of redevelopment on the site itself. Other considerations that we looked at was really assumptions on benefit costs as conceptual and subject change with real-time implementation. So as we start to look at if the Fed actually does drop the interest rate by a couple changes this year, that would impact overall market decisions as we move forward. But right now, the long-term market trends and potential airport complications are really, they're uncertainties. And so again, as we tried our best to look into that crystal ball when we did our economic analysis of this, it was just too hard to figure out, especially based on the other environmental conditions, floodplain conditions, and the environmental justice that we had to deal with. So our conclusion at the end through economic performance, because Commissioner Dom really wanted that economic performance to figure this out, to say we're not just pulling something out of the air, but what are the hard numbers when we actually looked at development, was really, as I said, scenario 2, high IRR, net present value, really aligns with more of the broader strategic considerations within the legislation, and it made it really the preferred, most sustainable pathway for airport property repositioning.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and to Frank for all the work that went into this. I maybe a quick remark, and then I do have a quick question. You know, you mentioned not having a crystal ball, and none of us do. And I mentioned at the outset that my focus has been, highest and best use, as I think it needs to be for all of us. And my background is as an investor. So I spent my career investing, and through either hard work or getting beaten up enough times, I have come to the conclusion that the only determinant of highest and best use is the market. And so my question for you is when you did your work, you mentioned talking to developers. I'm curious how broad you were able to determine whether you feel like the answers you were getting were a proxy for the market or more a proxy of a subset.
So our interviews, we did a very broad, deep, in-depth dive into the market, both at industrial scale, or the industrial uses, the retail uses, office commercial uses, and residential uses. So we talked to commercial real estates in all 4 of those sectors, as well as developers in all 4 of those sectors. And this was typically 3 to 4 different real estate agents within each of these subsectors, and then as well 2 to 3 different developers within each of these different sectors to be able to help us work through our actual costing, as well as looking at considerations on the site itself that we would have to take into consideration on any type of development scenario that we did bring forward.
With that, Senator, I'd love to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just my observations to the presentation. You mentioned the market conditions and the population decline in Hartford. Downtown has been anything but a decline in terms of population. And that's because of investment that's happened there, supported by CRDA, dramatic increase in population, vacancy rates very low. And I know you stated that, I don't know if you got this from the PRI study or what, but it seems like you did. There's great demand to live in downtown, whereas 10 years ago, the late Marty Kinney, when he started the first building, people said he was nuts. And that attitude has been dramatically changed. Today, you have Randy Salvatore with Downtown North. You have Spinnaker doing 55 Elm. You have the Bushnell initiative that is will be underway shortly. You have Lexington Partners doing multiple buildings. You even have now here in the shadow of the Capitol, the former Hilton Hotel, which has been a parking lot for years, where the family is looking at, for the first time, developing that for residential housing. All in an environment that no one wanted to touch 15 years ago. And I find it surprising that at no point did you mention, I'm sorry, you did mention the Connecticut River, but you mentioned it as an obstacle as opposed to a positive, that where East Hartford has proposed development, mixed use on the Connecticut River. Glastonbury has indicated an interest, Rocky Hill, Middletown, all these communities wanting to build on the river. But at no point in your presentation did you indicate that that was of any value to live and work and recreate at that location. Talking about Brainard. Go ahead.
Senator, we do feel, having been the authors in 1982 at 84 of Riverfront Recapture, we do believe there's great value to being on the river. So we didn't mean to imply that there's not. However, to exercise that value at this location, what the Hartford study said was they wanted to get views of the river. So we priced that out in the alternative Thomas described. And the price of doing that, almost all of the developments you mentioned, Mike Framath tells us the subsidy money going into that, the total development cost is about 20%. And it may be higher now, as Thomas mentioned. But cost at the airport would bring that up, in our view, to about 50% of total development costs. You got to subsidize it. It is so costly to build the piles and the parking and the structures and that type of soil at the airport to get views, any views over the dike. And we're pretty much told the Army Corps is pretty, considers the dike pretty sacrosanct. We're not going to be able to build on the dike. So we assume the same thing as the study in Hartford assumed, that you'd have to build up. And in order to do that, you'd have to put parking underneath. That parking itself is expensive. The piles going down are expensive. So the cost of getting to the river and maximizing that value is a very, very high cost. On riverfront recapture, when we did, yes, we had some high costs downtown, but we also had a lot of grant money and, quite frankly, state money in it. So we value the river. It's just the cost at this particular location of maximizing that value has been very challenging.
Now, I'm no engineer, but, just north of there, you have a convention center that is a substantial size on the Connecticut River. You have the Science Center, you have a hotel, all on the Connecticut River, direct proximity abutting the river. I don't know how maybe the soil conditions there are different. But it's not like we don't see development along the river. And further south into Wethersfield, there is an office building that is directly feet away from the Connecticut River.
You're correct on that, Senator Fonfara. But when we look at the downtown Hartford and where the construction is, most of it is built on ledge. And so you didn't have the alluvial till that you do have on this site, which goes into a lot of the cost considerations to build anything on this site. I come from the West Coast, and we typically try to stay away from alluvial till because if there's an earthquake, what we do get is liquefaction. And where that is, as soon as that earthquake hits, basically all of that alluvial till, because of that high water table, turns into basically liquid mud and sucks buildings right down. The only way to build on this site is to basically have to put in piles to get yourself above that water table and to be able to try to protect that building within this site, which again is different from downtown Hartford. And when you look at the redevelopment in downtown Hartford, again, we had extensive conversations with Mike Freemuth on this from CDRA. This is where Hartford is trying to put a lot of their development in, and that's where they're putting their capital stacks, which makes much more sense. And I agree with you. You are getting an increase in that population, which is offsetting of the population loss that we are seeing over the last 5 years. But it's not building up enough of that population to counteract and look at that market demand. Now, we're hoping that when we look at City of Hartford and they continue that development on there, it will continue to be successful, each of these different projects. Again, I talked to Clay Fowler from Spinnaker. I did talk to Randy Salvatore. In fact, I'm talking to him again on Friday about development up and around in this area from RMS companies. And so again, that's one of the things that they brought to our attention when we started to look at this development, especially on the Brainard and the additional costs that would bring in, even if you could get those river views that you're talking about.
A couple other questions. With respect to the FAA, which you've mentioned several times, and if we could do something, we added money to this study specifically to deal with the issues with the FAA. What did you do with respect to the FAA?
Sure. We have Ron Price from QED. He's actually on the Zoom call. And what I would like to do is we'll let Ron speak to that because he did that study with a sample closure report and the steps that would need to be taken for this.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good, great. Senator, we didn't contact the FAA directly because we have a good knowledge of what they would say if we brought to them the idea of closing the airport. And that's based on my experience in closing another airport. In fact, the last one that's ever been closed in the United States was in 2017, which is the one that I helped the community achieve that success. The FAA's position on closing airports is very clear. They have specific guidance on what to do to substantiate the basis for closing an airport. And that basis is essentially defining that the closure will result in a net benefit to civil aviation. As Thomas mentioned, they're really not interested in economic development issues. It's strictly aviation. Their focus is on aviation. If there was a move to close the airport, you would find that the FAA's response will be one of two things. One, they won't say anything. They'll stall, or they will say no. They are judge and jury on these matters, actually. So it's very, very difficult for them to justify closing an airport. That gives you the recourse to give them the opportunity to say no or say nothing and then take it to a higher level, which is the Congress, and which is what I had to do with the community that I represented back in 2017. But the law is very clear, and so there's very little room for legal interpretation here. Either justify it through the basis of a net benefit to civil aviation, or have somebody else tell the FAA that we think that there is a net benefit to civil aviation, so allow the community to close it. In our reports, we've given you a detailed report provides the basis for the net benefit to civil aviation. That document could be used by your airport sponsor, which is the Connecticut Airports Authority. Present that to the FAA. I've already indicated what the response will be, but at least you're going through the steps and giving them an opportunity to voice their opinion. Barring any answer or no answer, you can take it to a higher level. But that document is in place in the documents that we prepared. And we've also included some description of the steps to airport closure should that closure be approved. Does that answer your question?
Well, I didn't hear quite clearly. Did you say you did not contact the FAA?
No, we did not reach out to the FAA directly. Nor and the CAA offered no opinion as well. But I can tell you that the FAA's response would be, you have an airport, you have grant assurances that run till 2035. You're obligated to operate the airport until then, come back then.
So that if I have this right, we added money to the study to have explicit information regarding the FAA's position. And the consultant, am I correct in this, hired someone to say, this is what the FAA will say. Am I correct in understanding this?
So Senator Fonfara, I'd like to just add in, Ron, who's our FAA, basically our airport specialist. I did at the very start of the study, reach out to FAA numerous times. And I have emails to prove this, of us reaching out to them, but they never got back to us. So again, what Mr. Price is saying is typically on matters like this, the FAA is silent when it starts to talk about airport closures.
Yes, that's true.
Thanks. Lastly, in your presentation today, I did not hear anything regarding the value of the airport as it is today. And that was explicitly requested in the study. And the fact that there is approximately 100 pilots that use this for exclusively recreational purposes, to sit on 200 acres in the poorest city in the state of Connecticut, on the Connecticut River, 200 acres that could be developed. But your recommendation is to keep this as an airport so that 100 pilots can fly to Nantucket, the Jersey Shore, what have you, and continue to use this property, that is the highest and best use of these 200 acres in one of the poorest cities in the country. That's your recommendation.
Well, Senator, I just want to clarify, our recommendation is option 2, which will take 18 acres, really close the cross runway.
You don't know if you close it because you're saying that the FAA, your expert said that they don't close airports.
Well, actually, to just nuance that slightly, our understanding is that if the FAA believes that this airport, this is our our view from what we know from Ron Price is if we can close those 17 acres, they become valuable acres, particularly for industrial, but also for airport related uses, which could help the airport, the CAA, make this over the long term a net sort of airport that could at least operate without a loss. It has, as you know, a minor loss now. So that's our real recommendation. We think that closing the cross runway also would be, I don't want to say it's more attractive to FAA, but FAA would have less resistance to it if FAA view that the trade-off is the extension of the main runway, 5,000 feet, and that that would increase slightly use of the airport, make it a more viable airport. This is only one of 6 airports in Connecticut that has a tower. So this airport, and what we believe from Ron, that's why we brought Ron in. He's our expert on this. If you look at even recent reports in the Times and the Wall Street Journal on something called eVTOL, these new aircraft that are expected in 5 to 10 years that would allow more use of general aviation airports to bring people in from places like New York or Boston for short trips, that there's the potential for growth in the airport, so that what we're trying to do is get an improved airport and more income from those closed 17 acres. So it's a sort of a nuance, but that is our recommendation, because to go for either of the others, as Thomas has indicated, the cost of it is so great that it did not make sense to us in the final analysis for the residential, particularly the residential and mixed use alternative.
I fail to see how maintaining the use of 200 acres in the city of Hartford that's generating zero revenue for the city of Hartford or the state of Connecticut, as you've indicated, it is a money loser for 100 pilots that like to travel in very cheaply. They won't leave their planes at Bradley because it costs them more. This is a matter of great convenience for folks who can afford to fly recreationally. That is considered the highest and best use. That strains credulity. I will end it there. Madam Chair, you have
Representative Meskers has his hand up.
Representative Meskers.
Thank you to the chairs. Could I get a little more of a fiscal understanding here? So is the entire 200 acres alluvial, and that is the problem in terms of developmental potential? This is the first question.
Well, the best part of the airport in terms of least cost of development is those 17 acres on the cross runway.
No, my question is, we're talking about 200 some odd acres overall?
A majority of that 200 acres is alluvial. And so when you go back to the original, we had photos that we put into the report itself, really showing the flood conditions that you had before the Clark Dyke was put in there. And so you've had years, hundreds of thousands of years of basically.
But it's a floodplain. I understand. That's why I'm asking the question. Okay.
It's all.
So,
so the only reason we were able to get development, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but.
Yeah, so you've answered that question. So the next question, so what's the cost per square foot for that type of development on an alluvial plain? And what's the cost for soil remediation for the potential toxicity? I'm trying to get the numbers to understand the cost in terms of a repurposing of the property to get it to developable land. And I'm not sitting here as an advocate for or against. I need to know what dollars you want us to potentially provide for either to make it, enhance it for a developer, which is getting rid of the toxic soil clearly, and what's it going to cost per square foot for doing development on an alluvial plain. You said pilings. I assume the pilings have to go to a substrata that's stable. You're not, this is not Venice. You're not putting timbers into the alluvial plain and expecting to build on timbers. So I don't know what the cost is and how far down you have to go to get to ground to solidly build. I'm kind of asking two questions about the cost of developing the property?
So I've just put up on the screen again, the hard costs. So basically, step back up. Just for soil remediation, it's actually fairly cheap. It's about $1.5 million. And when we actually showed that to Deep, they were sort of surprised because of the high water table. A lot of it, what we had in there, just it goes. But it's the abatement demolition is about $6.6 million for all of the different buildings.
Right.
Is overall hard costs is about $41 million. For the industrial is 33 million, residential is 41. But it really goes down to when you actually start to go into the gross project value. You would need to put in just on the residential. You're looking at the residential land value of $511 million. That's the negative right there. So that's your.
So the negative is to make it versus working with ledge, working with alluvial, it's going to cost you about $400 or $500 million, you're telling me.
Correct.
So the choice of location on ledge would be 500 cheaper than working in alluvial plain.
Correct.
Okay, that was, there were too many numbers. I just wanted to understand what the nut to crack was to figure out what the development opportunity is. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A few questions. So crosswind runway closure is runway 11-29?
Correct.
Okay. So I see that under the environmental conditions that there you highlighted release areas, but there wasn't any release areas on 11-29. Was that shown that there was no release areas on that?
Yes, there was no release areas within that area. We did do testing in there. Majority of the release areas were around the existing buildings, but as you can see, again, I just put up the map right now. There's no building on that side. And so again, there's been no releases over there. Majority, oh, Matt, sorry. If we just show the environmental conditions map. There.
You need to reshare your screen.
Oh, great. So again, okay. There we go. So all the way when we did drilling through that entire area, basically there was nothing over there. We did do sampling through the entire site and we did additional sampling at the request of Deep, but that area had basically, it's just been grass and asphalt. So there's been no real releases. There's no underground storage tanks there. There's no any other building that's been on that site. So again, that has the least amount of environmental impact. And that being probably the furthest away from the river in terms of actual piles and everything else. Where the ledge is probably closer to the surface compared to getting closer to where it's.
But there was no testing done
Yes,
there.
there was testing in that area,
There was?
but there was nothing that was found.
Okay, thank you. And can you explain the seasonal flooding? I think it's the next slide, actually. How would that impact, if any, the runway itself, 11-29?
So again, that area right there does not have any flooding at all. It is far enough away from the dike and where there is seepage from behind Clark's dike. That is why Hartford's now moving forward with that toe drain project right behind the dike to be able to start draining that entire sort of grass turf runway area. And that is where we found a lot of the water would come up to the surface and create these little ponds throughout. 11-29 didn't have that at all because it is at a higher elevation. And it basically didn't have to, you didn't find the groundwater coming and seeping and pulling into that one area. So again, because of when we looked at that original photo, so going back here. So the airport property itself, that is why when you looked at the original 1971 redevelopment of Hartford Brainard, that's why it was positioned all the way over there. Because again, it was better soil and you didn't have the groundwater table as high in this area compared to where the current airport is.
What's that runway being used for now?
The crosswind runway is used about 2 to 5% of the time. And that is when the winds won't allow you to come in and land on 2-20. You come and land on that crosswind. The only thing with that crosswind runway, it is only allows for much smaller planes. So your smaller Cessnas, Beechcraft, stuff like that. Whereas the 220 runway is meant for the larger planes, and then if they have to divert, then they go to a different airport as opposed to landing in Kissimmee.
Okay. Under the floodplain considerations, how does that impact if we do carve out the 11-29 or go to your option 2? How does that impact the cost of the project? And were those costs, if there were any, were those costs included in your hard costs?
So the costs on that side were included in our hard costs. When we look at the floodplain considerations, there's really no improvements that need to be made along the 1129 runway, the crosswind runway. Most of the improvements needed to be done right next to Club's Dike in order to basically stop that seepage coming through. Again, as I pointed out, in 2019, that's when the dike was certified to. Right now, it is uncertified. So you have all these improvements that need to happen as soon as possible to be able to get that certification again on the dike, and then to be able to look at the type of developments within there.
So in other words, we'd have to spend this 42 million to,
Well, no, that's the entire length of the entire Clark's dike. Within this area, I think it was about 13 or 14 million that needed to be spent. You know, I believe the tow dike project, just to do the tows on it, it's about $10 million. I think it's, yeah,
to do the improvements in order to get certified.
yes.
Okay, and were those included in the hard costs?
Those were not included in the hard cost because the developer wouldn't be paying for that. That's coming under the Greater Hartford Flood Commission that is responsible for the upgrade, the upkeep and maintenance of the dike.
So there's a land swap also on these documents that you've presented here. What's the purpose of this land swap with the MPC, I believe?
So the land swap itself, going to that picture right now, that is under the current capital project program for CAA. And this would be able to lengthen runway 2-20 to accept a larger jet to come into this. So they wouldn't have to land at Brainard, they'd be able to land at this site here. Sorry, at Bradley, I mean, and be able to land at Brainard here. Because of the length of the runway, you are limited by FAA on the size of aircraft that can actually land at this airport. So when you look at what's currently landing there, it's the smaller jets. So if you look at the Hartford Jet Center fleet, it's a smaller jet fleet, as well as it's a lot of the smaller single engine and double prop planes that are within this that land at this airport.
You mentioned that the school that is on that south end, if that you know, your scenario 2 would take place, would that school need to be moved?
No, we believe it actually could sit in that area right where it is, and actually could entice certain aerospace industries to maybe look at the 200,000 square feet on that site as potential linkages with that school. We think that's a net benefit for the aerospace industry within this area. And actually, we're using it as a best case scenario. I'm actually working in Tompkins County, New York at the International Airport there to talk about a tech school potentially on the site of that airport as well, using the Brainard example as a best practice scenario. There is a lack of really people coming out to work on engines and aircraft. And right now, I believe CTR Aerotech School puts out about 160 students certifying them every year. So that would be, if we were to get rid of that, that would be a loss for our own industry within the industry.
Did you mention early in your presentation that there was a possibility of losing the school?
It depends on,
and a second building?
well, if you look at the full closure itself, you would lose, I'm just going to find it there. This, let me go back. Move that. So in red, that is where the state has the civilian air patrol building. You would lose that building. And so you have several federal agencies in there, as well as the state police that are in there that use that building for aircraft and as well as other uses. You would have to rebuild that building somewhere else at a different airport That new building would have to be built to level 2 under the Homeland, Department of Health Services, but under the Homeland Security standards for a new building. Because it is has federal uses within it. And we estimated this could potentially be anywhere from 30 to $40 million just to rehouse the services that are provided in the airport here.
And why would we have to take it down?
Well, if you close the entire airport down, you'd have to move them somewhere else.
Oh, I thought, okay,
If
so I'm reading
the
this
runway
scenario number 1,
1129
airports remains open. But you're showing that highlighted area.
Yeah.
That, why would we have to take that down if it's scenario number 1?
Oh, you wouldn't have to. You'd basically, if we just built on the runway 1129 to 200,000 square feet, you could potentially save the aerotech school. And then as well, you would have the existing runway continue to use and the state police in that building.
If we extend that airport to the south here.
Yep.
And do that land swap, would that building need to go down?
No,
Okay, so
We
we're
do that.
salvaging all that.
yes.
So in your report, and I'm surprised that there wasn't, I don't know if there's another document that came along with this. I just got this along, your slide deck here is what I have here in front of me. But the assessment and the development, if we didn't do anything, did you do any type of analysis regarding what type of development that we could do on that site or around that area?
Yes, so that would be our no action scenario 1. That is basically
Yep.
allowing CAA to continue their current capital program and basically extend the runway out, do the land swap, build additional buildings under the contract they currently have with several leasees on the site, and then look at potential redevelopment to the north in that area. So CAA would continue to control the building, control everything on the site.
Yeah.
You would have the runway 1129 would still remain in operation, and runway 2-20 would continue in operation, but you would have new buildings that you were showing in red right here on the no action. That would be what CAA would continue to do.
If we sold site, I know that the FAA would have to, they'll say yes or no. But you didn't mention anything regarding the closing down 11-29 runway.
Yeah.
So
Let me,
what would be the process of that?
Ron?
answer that question for you. Closure of runway 1129 is a less controversial or difficult item to achieve. Keep in mind that the runway is very short and is used by just the very lightest of aircraft. Number one. Number two, the FAA criteria for funding continued improvements on a secondary runway is based on the wind runway. Guidance is that the primary runway should provide at least 95% wind coverage. If it doesn't, then a crosswind runway would be justified. But in the case of Hartford Brainard, runway 220 meets that criteria. It provides more than 95% wind coverage, which means it's one of the reasons why 1129 is hardly used. Talking with discussions with the tower personnel, the chief there, he estimates the runways used maybe 3% of the time. And it also contributes to additional air traffic controller workload because of the positioning of the runway thresholds between the two runways. So that runway would not qualify for federal funding in the future. And the CAA has programmed down in the next few years $5 million to reconstruct that runway. So the FAA feels that that runway doesn't contribute to aviation needs. It won't fund it, and you'll be looking at a $5 million bill to improve that runway. So it's really not going to be that much of a challenge to get the FAA to agree not to fund the runway and to close it for better use. We still need their concurrence, but it's a completely different issue than asking them to support. Does that help?
So I guess what you're saying, you were broken up. So what I got is that it would not be that difficult to get the FAA to approve that sale. of that piece?
You're correct, yes.
Okay, so you're proposing two buildings, 110,000 square feet, I think, right?
200,000.
200,000 altogether. But yet across the river, there's another 2 million square feet being planned. So what type of absorption rate are we looking at here to, let's say overnight we get this approval and now we're off and like we want to do this. 2 million square feet plus this is a lot of square feet. Was there any type of analysis done on that?
So part of what we talked to the developers out there in the real estate market, there is a market for that 200,000 square feet because it would be basically a flex space. And so they have what they were telling us, and we got calls later on after we published the study. If that closes down, can we get at this right away? So we suspect that there are developers that if the CA was to partner with them to build that, we would see that development happen very quickly and have it filled fairly quickly. The larger space that we're talking about, the 2.2 million square feet and the larger warehousing, that's a different sort of category that we're looked at. Again, that I think is coming to almost peak, but the smaller flex spaces, there's just not a lot of that in the area. And that is really some of that market demand that we start to see out there.
And just one last question for me is, I don't know where your demographics and your economic conditions, and you make the comment, the region's goal is to increase manufacturing employment by 235,000 employees by 2033. We're looking at, less than 10 years from that. We had a hard time recovering the employees from the 2008 recession. And I don't even think we've hit that number yet. I don't know where did this number come from that we think that we're going to increase employment by 235,000 in the manufacturing sector.
So part of what we looked at was the overall CROG plans and where they were focusing their attempts to help boost the economy. Traditionally, within the Hartford area, we have a large manufacturing sector within this area. And so basically one of the ideas was if we did look at some type of development on this airport itself, we would be looking at some type of light manufacturing within this area that would actually make sense and actually help contribute to the goals of what the region is looking for.
So it's 235,000 jobs.
Well, that's the CROGs for what they would like. So,
okay. All right. Thank you.
If I can get a small piece of that
Thank
to help out the commissioner in
Thank you.
terms of his development and workforce strategy, then that's what we'll do.
Senator, I just add, that's another additional reason that Tom has covered in the slides, that we focused on the 17 acres of the cross runway. One, FAA will be more amenable in Ron Price's view to closing it. It's not needed for aviation, and it's in the best location in terms of it doesn't have the environmental or alluvial costs. For instance, it has no cost to do piles in that area, and cost of piles was about $200 a square foot to support a structure. So the cross runway had a lot of things going for it, and when we realized from Ron it was no longer necessary for aviation, we felt that led to the best alternative, that we keep the airport itself open, close the cross runway, use it for development that could help support the airport and make the airport closer to a good, I won't say profitable, but break-even operation.
That makes sense. The suggestion that you have here. I'm just a little bit surprised that there wasn't more, I guess, dialogue perhaps with those that are in the area regarding, gee, what type of development could we do? Around there. I know, a year ago when this piece of legislation was, adopted, I had read some various articles and then some other airports similar to Brainard that had successfully done economic improvements in their airports, and it was become pretty much a good economic engine. And I was expecting some of that here and just a little disappointed that we didn't do a little bit more in that area. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We're running up against our allotted time, but we have at least three more members who would like to ask questions. Representative Moore and Bello.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be brief. In both scenario 1 and 2, there wouldn't be any remediation to any of the environmental hazards that were found. Is that accurate?
So any type of new disturbance would have to be remediated in both the no action. So CAA would be responsible for any of the remediation on the site where they go into development. So you would have to file for your permits with DEEP. In scenario 2, again, we didn't find any environmental remediation was really needed in that area. So again, the cost on that would be much lower for development in that side.
And then also in scenario 1 and 2, they both call for the expansion of runway 220. Is that true?
So when we looked at the scenario 2, the only thing we looked at was really the development of the 18 acres on that site. We did not look at the expansion of the runway itself.
So
We assume scenario 2 would incorporate those improvements to the airport that are currently under negotiation. We wouldn't see those as stopping. So I think in answer to your question, I'd add the ideal scenario. I think scenario 2 would be development of those 17 to 18 acres on the cross runway. We'd close that. We would not have to relocate anybody. There are no structures on that, and the school, the aviation school, is not affected there. So there'd be no structures lost. So we would be able, the airport CAA would still be able to carry out their negotiations with the Metropolitan District Commission to expand the main runway. So you could have, under scenario 2, I think an ideal solution of helping the airport become a airport that's not solely about 100 private pilots or that number, but an airport that could accept more aviation, not commercial airliners like Bradley. It wouldn't compete with Bradley, but other aircraft, small aircraft, including jet aircraft. It could provide for a reasonable growth to the airport, and an airport that hopefully, with income from the closed cross runway, a break-even operation for the CAA.
And so that the runway expansion would be bringing in larger aircraft, including jets.
Yes, I want to be careful, though. This would not be commercial airliners. This would not compete with Bradley in any way by a jet aircraft that might have a one-engine, two-engine jet.
Yeah.
Okay.
If I could add to that, Frank, just so you know, most corporate jet operators in their insurance requirements will need to use a runway of at least 5,000 feet, or they won't be able to operate at that airport. So extension of the runway to the south to achieve a 5,000-foot runway is definitely a major positive.
I have a question, just so I understand. Does the longer runway and therefore the larger aircraft, it sounds like that will accommodate larger corporate aircraft, not necessarily larger industrial use cases or any industrial use cases?
Maybe, Ron, if you can explain the size of the aircraft for the 5,000 square feet, because you did have it in the report.
Well, a 5,000-foot runway will handle most medium-sized jet aircraft. And that's probably 75% of the jet fleet, of the business jet fleet. You won't see a 737 or any of those types of airplanes landing on a 5,000-foot runway. And I don't believe the pavement strength is strong enough to support them anyway. So the 5,000-foot runway will open the airport to a higher category of business jet aircraft that can operate on a 5,000-foot runway. Some corporate jets need more. But nonetheless, 5,000 is a industry accepted standard by the insurance carriers that will allow the aircraft that they insure to use that runway. So you are losing traffic right now because some aircraft operators cannot use your runway because it's too short. Even
So,
Okay,
so scenario 2 would be able to accomplish that and would also be able to use the cross runway as closed as an income producer. So that's what made us, that's what those types of issues, and thank you for asking those questions, made us, it led us to that scenario 2. You would get a better utilized airport with the long runway extended, maybe to accept corporate jets, you know, Cigna, Travelers, other companies in the greater Hartford area may be interested in. It could increase some use of Brainard and at the same time provide for some economic development such as industrial, but without getting into an industrial development that was so large that absorption would become a huge question for it. So we think that 17 acres can be marketed in the relatively short term. And Ron tells us that, again, the FAA would be much more receptive to the closing of a cross runway that they don't feel is necessary for aviation. So those two came together to form our recommendation on option 2.
thank you. I just had one other question. When you were doing environmental impact studies, did you look at the impact of the lead fuel that the planes use on, you know, the neighborhood surrounding the airport? Was there any kind of environmental impact to those around the airport when you were doing those studies?
No, unfortunately, that was not part of our scope. This was brought up at one of our public meetings. And we offered if we could get additional funding, we would go out and do air monitoring, but that was not part of the original scope for this project.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the answers to all those questions.
Representative Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My constituents love Brainard Airport. Yes, they use it for recreation, but they also use it for business travel. And they do love it. The Connecticut Aerotech School, to me, is one of the biggest assets, and the workforce development that we see there is immeasurable value. Are we currently partnering with area schools to get students in there for future aviation jobs?
Our understanding from, by the way, we haven't been directly involved with what I'm going to say, but our understanding at our public meetings from people who were from the school and neighbors in the area was that, yes, they were trying to partner with, for instance, local schools in Hartford, and they pointed out to us at the meetings that that was something that their complaint was that we were focused on numbers. And they said that's very hard to quantify the value of educating students into jobs that weren't just service jobs. They could be well-paying jobs someday. Those are hard for us to quantify exactly, but that came up consistently in our public workshops. We had 5 public workshops in the South End on this.
Thank you. I did have the pleasure of touring it, and it was fabulous, the school and the airport. Can you detail what public safety operations are currently being conducted at Brainard?
I would prefer not to, just for Homeland Security reasons. So
That's fine.
we did talk to pretty much everybody in the building, but it was officially, we can't go into detail.
Okay, that's fair. That's all, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Representative Sanchez.
Thank you, Senator Fonfera, and everyone. Thank you for the presentation. I think it was pretty interesting. Just to start off with, I'm a Hartford resident, born and raised here, and I am in favor of option number 3, residential, mixed use, and also keeping the Connecticut Aero Tech School in place. Just to share with everyone, I visited the facility twice as a state representative and as a councilman. And by eliminating the runway, both, or eliminating the airport does not mean that the school has to shut down. They may have partnered with some of the aircraft owners so that they can do some kind of maintenance work, but the school is a standalone entity, it's a standalone facility that does not require a flight line or a runway. So with that said, I do have a few questions, and thank you for allowing me to speak. So my first question, it was mentioned that pylons have to be buried or pounded into these grounds so that it can sustain the buildings. So I'm just curious, do you hire geotechnical engineering to investigate the subsurface and also the surface?
Yeah, yes, we did. What we did on this when we began, we interviewed environmental firms, and based on those, we hired Ty and Bond. They're a firm that has 3 offices here in Connecticut, and they did that environmental work for us. So what we're reporting back to you on is information that they developed in those terms.
Okay, thank you. And I did have the question about the lead effects in the quality of the air quality, because one of the things I learned in my own research, because I am a proponent of closing down this airport for that type of development, is that I believe it was San Jose, California. They did a study out there, and it resulted to a severe lead quality, or lead induced quality in the air, as well as on the surrounding communities, which are community of Black and brown folks, where they found lead even up to the windowsills and in the playgrounds of these students. So I was hoping that you did perform that study to see how severe it is around this area, this neighborhood. Question is my next question. We have ATP Flight School, Premier Flight Center, Total Aircraft Parts, Connecticut Valley Flyer in the Brainard Airport. What are the revenues that they bring into not only the city of Hartford, but the region? Because I haven't heard that discussion. What is it? How does the region benefit when it comes to revenue? What are the numbers?
I can try to answer that for you, Senator.
I'm a representative,
to
state legislator.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't mind the title, though.
All right, let's work towards that.
You should. Great.
The tenants at the airport are actually subtenants, and all of their leases run through Hartford Jet Center. And the Hartford Jet Center provides, I'm just looking at some numbers here, $600,000 of revenue.
What was the figure?
Well, wait, there's 6, I have to clarify that. The tenants that you mentioned, the flight schools, are subtenants of Hartford Jet Center. I don't have their rates per se, what they pay, but I do know what the Hartford Jet Center remits to the airport as their share, as the airport's share of their revenue. And the Hartford Jet Center is bringing in about $500,000 a year. Then there you have some T-hangar rentals, and they're owned by different entities. But just those flight schools. So there's $500,000 or so, maybe $400,000 in that range coming from the Hartford Jet Center for all of the fees that they pay to the CAA.
Okay. Oh, so they pay to the CAA.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So
these are ground rents and fuel flowage fees.
So what is the percentage of that revenue that supposedly benefits the region and the city of Hartford?
Well, their total revenues at the airport and the 2023 budget is about $600,000.
$600,000 for 200 acres of use, let's say.
Yes,
All right.
and okay.
Okay, so then in conversation with certain individuals in the CAA, or let's say in the flight business, it is my understanding that the FAA is not very supportive of funding an airport that is operating at a loss. So that's one of my understandings. And I wish you did reach out to the FAA, because I believe, you know, what Senator Fonfero said, that was one of the responsibilities, or it should have been done by this firm. So can you tell me what is the loss of revenue that they're operating on?
All right, first of all, just to clarify, the FAA does not have a position on not funding airports that operate at a loss. Most general aviation airports across the United States do not operate with a surplus. Most are subsidized by their local governments.
So then this airport.
So this is not atypical. Your results are not atypical.
Okay, so this airport is operating at a loss. Is that correct?
Yes, it operates at a loss of about $380,000 a year if you exclude their contributions to the pension program for all state employees.
Okay. And how many of those employees are state employees?
No, this is the contribution that's made to the Connecticut State Employees Retirement System.
Right.
It's their share of, it's the CAA share of those costs. So when you subtract them out, the airport budget for 2023 shows a loss of $385,000.
Okay, thank you. All right. So now I'm not sure if it was you, Mr. Price, or someone else made a comment about controversial. Why would this study be controversial? What was the reasoning behind it?
Why would this study be controversial?
Yeah.
If you took it to the FAA and asked for complete closure of the airport, that's your question, just to clarify?
No, I just curious as to why that comment was made.
Well, I'll let Thomas add to what I'll say, but at the public hearings that were held, there were people that were very supportive of closure, and there were people non-supportive of closure. So this is a big issue that can affect lots of people, and that by definition will make it controversial, in my view.
Okay, thank you. And then follow up on that. In all of your community outreach, what's the percentage of the community or the residents from the city, surrounding towns, and the region were present versus or opposed to the closure, and those who were supportive of the closure? What's the balance? Because I have gone to a couple of those meetings, and the majority of the room were all pilots, and none of them were from Harvard.
Representative, go ahead, Ron.
No, I was going to pass it to you, actually, Tom. Oh, Frank.
Representative Sanchez, we had five workshops, and I would say, and by the way, we would have to go back. We've got meeting records for these. I don't want to give you exact numbers, but I would say just from the commentators, a lot of residents from the South End, pilots also were represented. Some of the airport users were represented. And also at the fourth, I think it was the fourth session, then Mayor Bronin came and also spoke. So there were a variety of people, but I would say there was a good representation of residents of the area.
Can you share with us the percentage if you have it?
On the fifth workshop particularly, Wethersfield, I would say that residents of Wethersfield were fairly well represented. I can't, by the way, if you give us, what we can do is go back, we've made records of each workshop. And so I think we might be able to get a little bit more of a percentage breakdown for you. I don't have that at the top of my head right now.
All right, Nate, I'm sorry I'm taking so long. Just two more questions. So when you were performing the study, did you reach out to developers who specialize in brownfield? Because I've been doing my own research and I found that there's two major developers in the country. One of them being a P&L Investment Group, and what they do is they specialize in brownfield. Not that this airport is completely, contaminated, but they're specialized in remediation, refurbishing, and rejuvenating properties that are brownfield. Have you reached out to any of these major developers throughout the country, or was it just local?
The developers we reached out to were specialized in the market around this area, but due to the fact that remediation on the site was about $1.5 million for environmental, this is extremely small. And I don't think would warrant the level of a large brownfield developer to come in.
Well, when you have 200 acres, I'm pretty sure those folks will be very interested in working with 200 acres. It's quite a vast amount of land, and especially on the most prestigious riverfront in the state of Connecticut, there at the Connecticut River. So I wish you had at least attempted to reach out to the larger developers to see what they had to say and what their comments would have been or suggestions. I'll hold off on that last question. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Mashinsky, to be followed by Senator Moore. And I think that by 4:30, we should wrap this up. We're going to lose some folks to their schedules.
Thank you.
Representative
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I wanted to ask you, in the aerial view here, is that the one on the right? Is that the 1935 aerial?
Yes, so that was the Clark's when Clark Dike was started to be built, and the two other aerials that were put into there were the flooding of the area, which helped necessitate the building of the dike.
Okay. Yeah, the flooded ones are 38, right? 1938 for those flooded pictures.
They are, I'd have to check, but from my knowledge of having grown up here in Connecticut, it was 1938.
Okay.
I think that's a very safe assumption.
No, it's a really good photo because it actually shows the floodplain edges and how they keep changing. Before the dike went in, it was constantly changing, which explains why the alluvial soils are there. I just wanted to I went to several of your hearings and very interesting, sat with the public, and I'm not from this area, but my district is downstate, but it was very interesting to see the interaction at the tables there. And at the time we were sitting there, we were saying it doesn't make any sense to build housing next to an odorous wastewater treatment plant, because even when you drive through the area, you have to be careful not to, that your car is set on closed so that you don't get the odors in from the plant just driving through. If you had to live there, it would be tough. It would be tough to live next to a wastewater treatment plant. And you did mention that, I think, in your recommendations. I am glad you recognized the value of the tech school and the possibility of high wage jobs for Hartford area youth and residents. Today, where I was today earlier was over at Manufacturing Day, and about half the people in the room with their displays were aerospace folks. They're making aerospace parts and technology and tiny little, very expensive equipment, pieces for the planes and so on. And they were all recruiting kids from high school. And the kids were brought in today specifically for this trade fair, and they were walking from table to table and learning how they might have a career in aerospace, and especially building something for aerospace, so technical careers for aerospace. And what surprised me when you're on your item 2 is that you feel you can actually strengthen the financial health of the airport even with one less runway, because you think you can expand the use of education on the site as these corporate jets come in. I thought that was very interesting. So it would be less of a backwater airport and more of a, I guess greater business use, which would then help the school create more jobs that fit that. And
Yes, that's correct.
that's it's interesting how you figured out a way to expand the value of the airport as well. So that was, I didn't see that coming, and it was a really interesting recommendation. So I only have one other question is, what happens when the winds are the wrong way and the plane can't land on the alternate runway? Are they sent up to Bradley? Is that what happens?
I think Ron.
Sure.
Best.
First of all, the decision is made by the pilot and command. And if the crosswind limits for their aircraft are exceeded on runway 220, they could use the other runway, but remember that runway serves very, very light aircraft. So any aircraft of any size, you're not going to use 1129. You will go to another airport, maybe Bradley, maybe Waterbury, Oxford, Meriden, wherever is your choice. Not everybody flies under air traffic control mandates. A lot of flying is done visual flight rule, see and be seen, and the pilot in command makes decisions where to go. So if you can't land your plane because of strong crosswinds, number one, you should have thought about that before you left. And if you didn't, and winds change, that happens. You have to have alternates in mind, keeping in mind the fuel that you have remaining on board, and act accordingly. So that's where you go. You go to another airport that can take you.
Okay, thank you. I understand that's rare, but I do think about where they would go. Okay, the other thing is on the manufacturing technology, like all these companies that were here today showing off their products. Can they be located right at the airport? Could we have someone making these finely designed little parts and have the students working with them directly at the airport?
Well, we think they can, and I'll defer to Ron on this if he knows any reason why not, but the closure of the cross runway gives us 17 to 18 acres to deal with for light manufacturing, flex space, and airport-related space to support the airport. And the beauty of it is, as was mentioned earlier, I think it was Senator Martin who was asking these questions about the cross runway. That's the best place. We don't need piles there. We don't have development costs there. We don't have environmental costs on the cross runway. And it has the best access as you come in off the highway. So we thought that's ideal. And our hope is that income, particularly if it were a long-term lease from CAA to those companies, that income going to the CAA, Ron's airport, the airport loss in dollars for the airport now that Ron had is about that 380,000, that might be closed over time. And so that this could be, again, a break-even operation, which would be unusual for some of these general aviation airports.
Okay, well, thank you. It's an interesting study, and I wasn't sure about option 2, but you really made a good case for it, and I appreciate that you costed it out for us. So thank you.
Senator Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just ask a quick question. I know we're running out of time. I heard him mention what it would cost for a remediation. Was it 1.5 or for that area?
In that area, it's a little bit less. We did an overall soil remediation for the entire site because if you are to include the new buildings that are under the CAA capital plan, it's about $1.5 million. That would include the buildings to the north, the new hangars, everything else. In this area here, I believe was roughly about, because you have to take out the asphalt runway, I think we had a cost in roughly about $300,000 because you have to remediate for the asphalt that comes out.
And just thinking about shared housing, I heard about the odor and some of that would be detrimental to housing, but I also saw that it took 30 years for us to see a profit on that land. I don't know if you can put a price on profit when you talk about housing. So I just wanted to make that statement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Moore. I see no other hands up in the room nor online. So we'll wrap this up. I just make a couple of other observations really quickly. One is there's been a lot of talk regarding the Aerotech School. And I have history with that because I've been here long enough to know that I was part of, with Representative Sawyer, of moving that facility from Eastern Connecticut to here. And I could tell you, Senator Martin, that it has no connection whatsoever to this facility, never was intended to have any connection. It is a school, a self-contained school. And it's about how to fix airplanes from top to bottom, from front to rear. And it can exist anywhere and be the same level of effectiveness. Secondly, with respect to bringing in, and by the way, I don't know if we could have gotten a better result if the question we asked in the study was how to enhance this airport as opposed to what we asked. But nonetheless, we are where we are. 20 minutes from this airport, there are 15 airports. That's not existing in your study. There are 15 airports within 20 miles of this airport. I should say not 20 minutes, 20 miles. Some of them are grass, but some of them are regular airports. And lastly, 20 minutes up the road is Bradley Airport, Bradley International Airport, that seems to get short shrift in terms of its ability to handle all that you talk about, but you talk about enhancing this airport, which again, I repeat myself, is 200 acres adjacent to another 100 acres of which the city of Hartford has absorbed the garbage from the state of Connecticut for 40 years. Is now closed and hopefully will be remediated. So that's 300 acres, not to mention another 20 acres of an underutilized regional market. So you have 300 plus acres that I suspect that anybody in this chamber, in this legislature, had that in their districts, they'd want to develop that. Never mind in the poorest city in the state of Connecticut, one of the poorest in the country, abutting some of the poorest neighborhoods. That doesn't get much attention whatsoever. So I'll leave it that perspective with you. And I thank you very much, Commissioner, on your first day and officially in the job. Sorry you had to spend 2.5 hours with us, but appreciate you being here and your contribution, and to the gentlemen for their remarks today.
And thank you. Always happy to do it. And my door remains open to all of you if you'd like to discuss further.
Thank you. Madam Chair, any closing remarks?
None.
Thank you. Therefore, we will adjourn.